The DNA doesn't add up. Ask most Americans where Appalachian people come from, and the answer comes instantly. Scotland, Ireland. Fiddles and surnames carried into the hollows of the mountains. The story sounds clean, it sounds settled. It has been repeated for over a century, but the DNA doesn't agree, not entirely, because beneath that familiar picture of the Scots-Irish mountaineer, there are layers the old myth never accounted for. Indigenous nations who called these mountains home for thousands of years before a single European boot touched the soil. African ancestry buried under racial law, hidden in plain sight. German settlers were quietly erased from the record by 2 world wars, and communities so isolated by geography that their genes began to reflect the mountains themselves. The familiar answer isn't wrong. It's just the last layer of a much older, much stranger story. So, what are the layers underneath? To understand what that story actually looks like, start with the mountains. The Appalachian Range is one of the oldest mountain systems on Earth, ancient enough that geologists believe it formed before Pangaea broke apart, before the Atlantic Ocean existed, before the continents looked anything like they do today. It stretches roughly 1,500 miles, from Alabama and Georgia in the south, all the way to Maine and into Canada in the north. But here's what most people miss. It is not one uniform chain. It is a series of overlapping ridges, deep valleys, narrow hollows, dense, almost impenetrable forest, broken by rivers and cut off from the lowlands by terrain that, for most of human history, made movement slow and communication nearly impossible. That geography is not background information. It is everything. The mountains didn't just shape the culture, they shaped what mixed, what stayed separate, and what survived. They acted like a genetic filter, allowing some bloodlines in, keeping others contained, and preserving patterns that would have vanished anywhere else on the continent. Which means to understand Appalachian DNA, you first have to understand one thing. These mountains have always been a world unto themselves. The modern identity attached to this region is one of the most distinct in all of American culture, a specific dialect with deep roots in Older English and Scots speech, a musical tradition that runs from ballads carried across the Atlantic to bluegrass hollowed out from coal-dusted hills, a religious intensity rooted in Presbyterian and Baptist traditions, a fierce attachment to family, land, and community. Millions of people across West Virginia, Eastern Kentucky, Southwest Virginia, Western North Carolina, Tennessee, and into parts of Georgia and Alabama identify with this place as a cultural homeland. But here is the first important thing to understand. Appalachian is not an ethnicity. It is a geography that became a cultural container. And into that container, over several centuries, came a remarkable diversity of people whose DNA tells a story far more complicated than any single origin myth can hold. The dominant myth, the one that filled textbooks and shaped popular imagination for most of the 20th century, is that Appalachia was primarily Scots-Irish. And in one sense, this is not wrong. Beginning roughly in the 1710s and continuing through the Revolutionary era, large numbers of Ulster Scots, Lowland Scots, who had spent a generation or two in the Ulster province of Northern Ireland, made their way across the Atlantic. They landed mostly in Pennsylvania, then moved south and southwest along what became known as the Great Wagon Road, following the valleys of Virginia, flowing into the Carolinas, pushing into Tennessee and beyond. They brought Presbyterian faith, a lowland Scots dialect, and a hardened frontier sensibility forged by decades of living in contested land. Their cultural imprint on Appalachia was enormous. It is real. It is documented. It is still audible in the language. But the story of how this myth became the whole story is revealing in itself. In the early 20th century, the first wave of ethnographers and folklorists studying Appalachia actively promoted the Scots-Irish narrative. They wanted to frame mountain people as a kind of preserved British stock, isolated, pure, and ancient. The British heritage was presented as pure and ancient. That framing served particular purposes at a particular moment in American cultural politics. The American context shaped the narrative, and it had a specific casualty. German settlers, who had been among the earliest and most numerous pioneer groups, especially in western Pennsylvania and southwest Virginia, were largely written out of the popular account. The early ethnographic record, as historians have noted, disregarded German cultural contributions almost entirely, likely shaped by the anti-German sentiment that followed the two world wars. The descendants of Palatinate German immigrants who had cleared and farmed Appalachian land in the 1720s and the 1730s were absorbed into a story that had no room for them. If the Scots-Irish story was always incomplete, the first question is, who else was there? And the second question is harder. Why were some of them forgotten? The oldest layer of all is also the one most thoroughly displaced. Long before any European ship landed on the Atlantic coast, the Appalachian Mountains were home to indigenous peoples. In the southern mountains, the Cherokee had established deep roots by around 1000 CE. The Shawnee and related groups occupied parts of the central and northern range. These were not marginal presences. The Cherokee alone had a pre-contact population that may have numbered in the tens of thousands and controlled territory across western North Carolina, eastern Tennessee, northern Georgia, and beyond. Their towns, trails, trading networks, and agricultural knowledge were woven into the landscape of these mountains. Then, a European contact arrived, and with it, disease, displacement, and eventually the forced removals of the early 19th century. The Indian Removal Act of 1830 cleared most of the Cherokee from their homeland in what became one of the most devastating episodes in American history. Some fled, some were taken west. A few thousand remained in the eastern mountains, becoming the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians based in North Carolina, who are there to this day. The genetic trace of this indigenous presence in the modern Appalachian population is a question that popular culture has handled badly. Tens of millions of Americans claim Cherokee ancestry as part of their family story. Population geneticists have a name for this phenomenon, the Cherokee syndrome. It refers to the widespread American belief in a Cherokee ancestor that often cannot be confirmed through genetic testing. This is not an accusation. It reflects something real about how American identity works, and also something important about the limits of consumer DNA testing. These tools are not reliable detectors of small amounts of ancient indigenous admixture, especially ancestry from several generations back. The scientific story here is not about confirming or denying individual claims. It is about acknowledging that indigenous peoples were present in these mountains for thousands of years, shaped the land and the culture, and were then largely removed, leaving an absence that the national mythology has struggled to address honestly. The second hidden layer is African ancestry. This, too, has been written out of the popular Appalachian story, but by 1790, roughly 10% of the Appalachian population was African American, both enslaved and free. The southern half of the region had slaveholders, including, notably, some Cherokee slaveholders as well. The northern half had smaller numbers. After the Civil War, many freed African Americans remained in the mountains, acquired land where they could, and established self-sustaining communities that contributed to the region's agricultural economy and its culture. Then, beginning in the 1880s, the coal industry transformed Central Appalachia almost overnight. The population of the Central Plateau increased nearly sixfold in 40 years as corporations stripped the mountains of timber and coal. Large numbers of newly freed African Americans and poor immigrants fresh from Europe flooded into the mining camps. African Americans shaped Appalachian music in ways that are still not fully acknowledged. The banjo, which most people associate with Appalachian mountain tradition, has West African origins. The fiddle traditions that became the backbone of what would evolve into bluegrass emerged from a mixture of Celtic, African, and other influences that played out in the same mountain communities, often invisible to later historians who preferred a single origin story. Then there is the most dramatic case of hidden ancestry in the entire region. Deep in the hollows of northeast Tennessee, southwest Virginia, and eastern Kentucky, there were communities of people who did not fit any simple racial category. Dark-skinned, sometimes with straight black hair, sometimes with blue or green eyes. They were called Melungeons, a term whose origin is still debated. And for generations, these communities told extraordinary origin stories. They claimed to be Portuguese, or Turkish, or Native American. They called themselves free persons of color. They moved frequently, often westward, and researchers have noted a saying that captured what was happening. You turned white when you moved west. This is where the DNA becomes deeply important and deeply human. A peer-reviewed study published in the Journal of Genetic Genealogy, based on research led by genealogists and genetic researchers, including Roberta Estes and Jack Goins, found that Melungeon core families carry primarily sub-Saharan African paternal lineages and European maternal lineages, with some Native American ancestry appearing at later stages of migration, Portuguese ancestry, Turkish ancestry, the Mediterranean mystery. These were not documented origins. They were survival strategies. Under the racial laws of the 18th and 19th centuries, being classified as African American could mean losing land, voting rights, and in some cases freedom itself. So, families constructed origin stories that placed their ancestry somewhere safer, somewhere exotic, somewhere white enough to function in a brutal legal system. The DNA remembered what the documents tried to erase. The Melungeon story is not just the story of one community. It is a window into what racial law does to genetic memory. It shows how people will build myths around their ancestry when the truth is not safe to tell. What the DNA also shows is that Appalachia is not one genetic reality. The region spans too much geography and too much history to be treated as a single population. The northern section, Pennsylvania, New York, the northern ridges, carried heavier German Palatinate and English settlement, more contact with later immigrant waves, Welsh miners imported for their metallurgical expertise in the 19th century, and Eastern European workers who arrived with the industrial economy. The central section, West Virginia, Eastern Kentucky, Southwest Virginia, was the most isolated. Small founding families settled into deep mountain valleys with limited outside contact for generations. Population geneticists describe what happens in situations like this as a founder effect. When a small group establishes a community in geographic isolation and marries mostly within that community, their genetic patterns become amplified in later descendants. This dynamic has been documented across mountain and island populations worldwide, and the evidence suggests it operated in central Appalachia as well. Some recessive genetic conditions have appeared at elevated rates in certain isolated communities in this region, a pattern consistent with the genetics of small founding populations over many generations. The southern section of the range tells yet another story. The Cherokee homeland, the Melungeon zone, stronger African American presence, a warmer climate that allowed limited plantation agriculture to take hold and leave its mark. Now take the Scots-Irish story itself and apply the same lens. The Ulster Scots who came to Appalachia were already a layered identity. Lowland Scots who had spent generations in Ulster had absorbed Irish genetic and cultural influence before they ever crossed the Atlantic, and Lowland Scottish ancestry itself carried older layers: Norse settlement along the coasts and islands, Barytonic Celtic populations from the pre-Roman era, Anglo-Saxon migrations from the early medieval period. There was no pure ancestral source to begin with. The phrase Scots-Irish describes a migration route and a cultural identity. It describes a religion, a dialect, a set of frontier attitudes. It does not describe a biological unit, and that is not a criticism. That is how all human populations actually work. The label was always cultural first. The DNA was always more complicated underneath. The same logic applies to the banjo, to the log cabin, to the surnames and the ballads and the mountain foodways. Researchers have traced the log cabin tradition in Appalachia not to British settlers, but to Swedish and Finnish immigrants who were among the earliest European arrivals in the region and carried woodsman knowledge from Northern Europe. That detail did not make it into the mythology. Neither did the German farmers, the Welsh miners, the African American musicians, or the Cherokee trails that European settlers later walked as if they had always been there. What the DNA evidence currently supports is not a simple story. It supports a layered one. Ancient mountains shaped who stayed and who mixed. Indigenous peoples left traces that the historical record often obscures. African ancestry entered the region early, was suppressed legally, and survived in communities that rebuilt their identities to avoid destruction. German and other European settlers contributed to the foundation of Appalachian life, and were then erased from the popular account by forces that had nothing to do with the mountains themselves. A founding effect amplified certain genetic patterns in isolated valleys. And the Scots-Irish, real and important and culturally dominant, were themselves a product of migration, mixture, and multiple older ancestry layers going back long before any of them set foot in Ulster. Autosomal DNA, the broad mixture inherited from many ancestors across all lines, is the most complete tool researchers have for understanding these patterns. It does not trace just one father's line or one mother's line. It captures the accumulated result of generations of mixture, movement, and survival. And what it shows in Appalachia is not purity. It shows convergence. Multiple populations arriving at different times through different corridors, shaped by the same ridges and hollows, forged into a recognizable regional identity that was never the product of one bloodline. The mystery of Appalachian origin is not solved by DNA. It is made more interesting by it. The mountains that isolated these communities and sharpened their culture also preserved the evidence of how genuinely complicated their origins were. A region often stereotyped as monolithic turns out to carry one of the most layered genetic and historical stories in all of North America. Scots-Irish culture was real, so was the indigenous world that preceded it. So was the African ancestry that lived beside it, was hidden within it, and shaped it from the inside. So were the Germans and the Welsh and the Finnish woodsmen and the coal camp migrants. The identity that emerged from those mountains is not simpler for knowing this. It is far more worth knowing. Genetic ancestry is not a ranking. It is not a certificate of belonging. It is evidence of something much older and much more human. Movement, survival, mixture, and the way a mountain range can hold the memory of everyone who ever crossed it.